session 5. This evening, we're going to be talking about operations, and we're very excited to have a couple guest speakers. We have Lisa Isaac coming on board to talk about all your HR needs from a small business perspective and what you need to consider for your business plan from a human resources and operational perspective. Lisa, I welcome you. I'm very excited to have you on board to discuss the HR perspectives and what we need. And I will give you the floor now.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. What I'll do, so we're going to go through a whole bunch of HR management stuff. I am going to do an introduction if you guys are like, who the heck is this person talking? But I'll let you know what we're going to talk about first. And then I'll do an introduction. And then I'm going to talk. And if, anyway, you'll get it. You'll pick up. Jump in. This is about you guys, and I'm happy to answer questions. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through some of this, talk about the operations piece, right, and all the important pieces of the business plan. And then what my part of this is going to be is very much to kind of explain how I've seen that in practice on various different levels, different kinds of businesses. If you do have a question, you pop in. I'm happy to know kind of what the industry is, because there are differences between different industries. So that's often helpful if you have a very specific question, is letting us know what that is. And yeah, so we're going to go through this. We're going to go through a lot of the HR management pieces of stuff, which when I explain in HR to people, what does that mean? Well, essentially it's anything that has to do with people, which is essentially everything. And so I try to break it down a little bit more and think of it as compliance as your foundation. These are the things you must do to legally operate a business. And then on top of that, you get your operations, and that's the piece about doing HR. And so this is your kind of your standard recruitment and performance management, termination, that kind of stuff. And at the very top, you get your HR strategy. It's a tiny piece of the pyramid, but it's really important. And so there's pieces that we'll go through today that's part of all of that. So before I get too far, I'll introduce myself. My name is Lisa Isaac. I lead a team of HR professionals. I run an HR consulting company, and we support, so myself and my team, we support businesses, so whether they're for-profit, not-for-profit. We also support Indigenous organizations, so sometimes Indigenous businesses, Indigenous First Nation governments, and all sorts of organizations right across Canada and the US. And so we are very much focused on HR operations. So how do you actually operationalize kind of your people stuff? And so we do a lot of things like policy writing and training and coaching and development. We do investigations for workplace situations, and we do some research, and we do some really cool projects around technology and change management and all sorts of fun stuff. For me, my background is in HR. I was an HR researcher and writer for a bit. Prior to that, I was in the plants in the HR department here in Sarnia. I was with the banking industry before that, and I lived in Calgary. I was in Iqaluit. I was in Ottawa, and kind of come full circle back to Ontario. I'm from a small community called Moose Point First Nations, a couple hours north of Toronto. Beautiful on Georgian Bay, terrible internet, not very functional to be able to work from there. So I'm here in Sarnia. And it's a lovely town. I've been here for about 10 years now, maybe 11 going on. And so what I bring to this is just a lot of kind of a variety of experience. I am telling you now, I don't have all of the answers by any means, but I'm happy to take any that I can't answer, and I'm happy to get some research back to you guys, and you can send that out at a later time. Okay, so again, it's about kind of thinking through what these things are, and I'm kind of just here to help facilitate the discussion. I'm sure many of you have a lot of really great experience already, and I'm excited for you to jump in if you do and give tips to your colleagues here on the call, because I think that's also important, is to share those learnings. Not only is it helpful for somebody else, but it also helps you articulate your experience, and especially when you're writing your business plan, it's really important to practice that. And I can tell you, I'm 4 years into my business, and I am still practicing my elevator pitch and making sure that I've got those right. So practice is good. Okay, let me see your reaction if you're ready to get into some content. This is a test. You guys paying attention? Couple. There we go. All right. Some hand claps, some thumbs up. Nice. Okay, so it sounds like we're good. So we're going to jump into this. So when we're talking, what are we talking about here? So if one of the first pieces of your business plan, right, is the professional advisors. And there's a whole group of people, and you have some amazing people on this call right now that I'm sure will go into your business plan. And I'm sure that group is much larger. I know when I did this for my plan, that that list was a lot bigger than I thought it was. So it's very cool to see the amount of people that come together to support you in that entrepreneurship and growing. Again, if you have specific questions, because I may fly through things that I don't necessarily know what's important to you guys. So make sure you jump in if you need to. All right, this looks like it might be a bit of a pitch for you, Jennifer. If any of these consulting services, this business advisor.
If you want me to do this part, I can, if you want.
That'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, until we get to the HR part. I forgot these parts were here. So when you're looking for professional advisors, it really benefits from networking around the community to find out what other businesses and non-competing businesses are using. So who are they using as a lawyer? Who are they using as an accountant? And ask pertinent questions as to what you're trying to find to fulfill your needs. It's not going to be a one size fits all for everybody. So you really need to investigate the backgrounds, what their experiences are. Can they take you on? Do they have an overwhelming caseload that they might not be able to take you on? These are all pertinent questions. I need you to remember that in these dynamics where there's professional advisors, they are working for you. You are interviewing them. It's not the other way around. I know a lawyer, and I've seen enough lawyers, can be very intimidating. But remember, at the end of the day, they're working for you, and you should have a set criteria of questions that you're asking each of these, whether it's an accountant or a lawyer, to make sure that you can compare the criteria effectively from one to the next. Ask around to see who uses who and why. And this is where memberships at the Chamber of Commerce, for example, really benefits, because then you can find out what people are locally in the community. Yeah, there's ratings online and stuff, but Sarnia is a small enough community that you can, and intimate enough that you can find out some very personal and good references for who uses who in the community. Ensure to ask about their previous advising experience. What have they done before? Are they new? Have they been in the industry for a long time? Avoid any conflicts of interests servicing competing businesses. Although Sarnia is small, so that is to be expected to a certain degree. But this is why we have non-disclosure agreements and confidentiality agreements too, and to avoid these conflicts of interest and maintain that fiduciary relationship. Ask about any previous successes and challenges. Like I said, it's their job interview, right? So they should be performing. Ask them about hypothetical scenarios and how they would respond to those certain situations. I'm sure Lisa probably can attest to this. Scenarios are used a lot in any of your interviews, are they not? To see how people respond in a real world context. So you flip it around. Ask your lawyer or your insurance agent what they should have, and these people are necessary. Don't use a cousin, for example, that might practice family law. You need somebody if you're, for example, registering a patent or intellectual property. Chelsea Cooper will be able to speak more of this in session 7 when we start talking about it. But you should ask for, or you should secure the applicable discipline that you need for whatever your business is, and not just utilize somebody who might be a family friend, for example. Ask if they've worked with businesses similar to yours and see what those competing interests are. So that would be at the bottom in your PowerPoint presentation. We don't have to go to this today, but there is consulting services for Canadian businesses that the Business Development Bank of Canada puts forth. We will have somebody speak. Part of what you need to provide for your next, well, we provided this on module 1 actually template. I wanted you to wrap your head around who are you going to use as accountant? Who will you use as insurance? And even if you work solo, you still need some form of insurance. And Chris will be able to speak for that when he comes on later, if he comes on, and what law firm they're using, and obviously the bank as well. A winner obviously will win a bank account as part of that award package, but you should secure a particular bank and make sure that they specialize in business services as well, because certain credit cards are going to be applicable just to businesses versus personal use, for example. And especially if you are like a partnership or an incorporation, you really want to keep those separate and very refined from a banking perspective. Thanks, Lisa.
No problem.
Is there any questions, sorry, before I give Lisa the floor about professional advisors from anybody? All right, seeing none.
I have one comment. I know just from my experience, I've had multiple professional advisors for each of these sometimes. So depending, right? So I have one lawyer that's a contract lawyer, but one lawyer that's an employment lawyer, and one lawyer, right? So depending on what the need is. So it's not like you just need one who knows everything.
Yes, absolutely. And it's important to not consult them too much that you're paying a lot of money. Obviously, they all have different payment structures. You need to investigate that a little bit more. Do they charge hourly? Do they charge retainers, et cetera? But you don't want to consult them infrequently either, because that could be very costly for a business as well. So Chelsea will be able to speak more about this in session 7 about overlooking contracts and putting together employment contracts and stuff. But Lisa will be able to attest to that based on that discipline today from an HR perspective. But having a lawyer is very, very important to review any of the documents, even if that you can put them together. And there's templates available out there, obviously, as well. But you really want to make sure a lawyer overlooks it or just reviews it to make sure that everything is tickety-boo, for lack of better terms, to make sure you're not going to have any issues, because if you do, legally speaking, it's going to cost you a lot of money in the long run.
Absolutely. We'll talk a bit more about that as well. All right, so HR management. So we're going to go through, we're going to talk a bit about planning. And then, so once you've decided to hire somebody, what is that process? What do you think about? What do you do? How do you work through that? We'll talk about policies in a bit. We'll talk about that actual hiring. How do you actually hire someone? And then that whole piece of once someone's on, how do you manage them? And then we'll get into some more of that compliance piece around government requirements, health and safety, record keeping, all that super fun stuff, which you have to do anyway, right? So that's what we're going to talk through. When we're starting off here, though, what we're talking about is trying to plan and determine what is your personnel requirement. Do you need people? And this is often, I actually had a conversation with a group this morning. It's a very anxiety inducing kind of process, and part of running a business is thinking through, when am I ready to, either bring on and make one of those contractors, make them an employee. And this is a really important part that you really need to think through a lot of these different points around what kind of support, what kind of people, what kind of skills, how many hours, what do I need to run my business? And I want to touch a bit too on that whole piece around contractors versus employees, because you can do both and you can do a mix of both. Both come with pros and cons, and there's some legal requirements around a lot of that, and there's some financial requirements around a lot of that. And so it is really important to make sure that you're thinking through, okay, first of all, what kind of manpower do I need to run my business? And I know even for myself, I spend a lot more time running my business than I do in working in my business. So I need to hire more people to do more work, but then I have more time running my business because I have to now manage people, right? So there's a bit of a balance, and this is kind of an ongoing thing. So when you're at your earlier stages, you're creating your business plan, it's about thinking through all of these so you can make an educated decision on what that would be. And so some of the things to think through when you're thinking about what kind of people do I need, who do I need, all that kind of stuff, is so not only the tasks, and one tip that I've heard is the 20 rule. If you have 20 tasks, or if you have enough tasks that would take 20 hours in a week, you probably need to hire somebody. Right? So just kind of a rough idea. And so thinking through all of the things that you do in your business, how much time does it take you, or does it take your partner, whoever it is that's doing the work with you, and kind of laying that out and trying to understand what would it be to bring someone on instead. So thinking through what are the tasks, then on top of that, who's responsible now for managing this person, because there comes the training and the coaching and the support. And, sometimes if they're not necessarily doing it the way you would do it, you have to kind of have a little bit of flexibility or teach them more. So there's this piece really ultimately about thinking through what support do they need once we bring people on. And I want to just say, I don't think I've met anyone who's underestimated the amount of time it takes to manage people. It's always way more than you think. And so just work that in when you're planning this piece. And then the timing as well, right? You don't need to necessarily hire somebody on January 1 for the entire year full time. Maybe there's a phased approach, right? So year 1, you might bring in one person, year 2, a couple more. And so there's all of these different scenarios that you can think through, and you can mix different types of employees and different types of personnel that you need to support your organization. So once you've decided kind of what and when and kind of the timing of how they're going to do that, you have to determine what you're going to pay them. And so oftentimes in your industry, you'll know a little bit of kind of what the rough estimate of what is the going rate. And you're, welcome to do market research table to find out exactly kind of what that range is. And then you get the choice of making the decision on how am I going to pay someone? Am I going to pay them at market rate, which is kind of the general average of what people are paid in that industry at that level? Or as a new business, are you paying them below market rate consciously, but you're offsetting the why would people want to work for me for less money? Well, because it's a cool startup, or because of the intrinsic value of what we do, right? Or flexibility in work, or whatever it is. There's a whole bunch of value that goes into it. So as you're thinking through this, and as you're writing your business plan, you're also kind of creating your employee value proposition as well. And so why would people want to work with you? And you really need to articulate that, and that'll come into all these other pieces like hiring and all that other good stuff in the future. So once you've decided what you're going to pay somebody, there's obviously additional costs on top of that. And you can do an exact calculation to figure out what your EI, your CPP, any WSIB insurance, all of these extra costs that come along with having employees. And then on top of that, you now have to pay for payroll services, which are, right, they generally start at about $25 a month per. And then on top of that, maybe $4 or $5 per person. So these are some of those costs that you can start to think in how do those go in? Rough estimate I like to use is kind of the what are you paying them salary plus 30% admin costs. And it kind of roughly covers off your remittances and all of those things that you have to pay, plus any kind of additional things, plus your mandatory training that you have to pay for, plus kind of that admin of now running and managing people. So again, 30%, that's not science, that's just kind of my experience and what is kind of a rough gauge if you're trying to plan, can I afford to hire somebody, or how many somebodies can I afford to hire? So as you're thinking through all of these, you're jotting them down, you're making your plan. You're also trying to consider, when or if you add benefits or additional perks and all of these other pieces that come along with it. We'll talk a bit more about those in a bit. And if you are, do they come in? If you are a chamber member, I know they have a benefits plan as well, a group benefits plan. So there's so many options that's out there. And trying to think if that's even something that you offer. Is it normal in your industry? Is it something that you can do to attract people to your organization? All these things are things that you want to kind of roughly consider, unless you know for sure that that's what's going to happen, and then you probably want to get a little bit more granular about it in your plan. And then there's options too around shifts and timing, and are they part-time, are they full-time? Do they have a specific schedule, right? Or do they working 9 to 5? Do they have core hours of say 10 to 3, and then they make up those extra 2 or 3 hours at whatever time they want? Just over the last 2 years, right, people have become a little bit more comfortable with that flexible work arrangement, and sometimes it's something that might attract employees to your organization. And so there's all of these different pieces to consider, and it'll be different for every organization, every industry, and every situation. Any questions on kind of the planning for personnel and your structure? I think as we get through here, there's a bit too about who are they reporting to. Is your structure flat? Are you adding in supervisors and managers? Do you have departments? That kind of thing. And I can tell you from my experience, I didn't necessarily plan on having a large team. And then departments kind of formed themselves. So I have an HR department and I have a projects department. And I'm to the point now where I'm trying to think, do I implement supervisors or do I not? All of that kind of stuff. So it doesn't necessarily have to happen now, but if you have a rough idea, it's always helpful that people know, right, that you've thought through this plan, and it's helpful for you to budget and to prepare. Pause there for a second. If there's any questions, again, reaction, chats, raise your hand. Not seeing any. We're getting into it. We'll get into the good stuff later. All right, so when we're looking next here, so let's say that you have decided you're going to hire, what's the next piece in this personnel management part of kind of running a business? Well, you actually need to go out and find people, right? So where are you going to find them? How are you going to find them? How are you going to attract them? You might have heard in the last year or so of the Great Resignation. Right. So people now have a lot of opportunity to leave jobs that they don't necessarily love or that don't work for their lifestyle, and people are leaving them and they have a lot of choice. So right now, all employers are struggling to find the right talent to fit their organization. Recruitment is very hard right now. So it's important to think through this whole process and how are you going to do it, because it can take a very long time. It can be very quick. But it could be a costly thing if you're spending a lot of time and energy on it. So thinking through it and planning in advance is often pretty helpful in order to be able to get it working for you really well. So one of the things that we're all familiar with probably is job descriptions. And that's ultimately, excuse me, kind of a list of what are the main duties, tasks, what are the accountabilities, the responsibilities, right? So those are the things that you would say, do they have direct reports? Are they responsible for a budget? Do they have responsibility over a major section of materials or of company materials or product? And that kind of a thing, or do they have responsibility over finances, right? So there's all these different pieces that go into that job description. Again, you can get super duper fancy with it, where you can go, full accommodation, job evaluation, where you're literally, right down to how much time do people spend on their feet versus sitting, all that kind of stuff. You likely don't need to do that now. Although if you are thinking about bringing in employees who may need accommodations for things like disabilities, whether they're visible or invisible, that then becomes more important, because that's the kind of thing that you'll look at on making those accommodations. So these things are probably important, but in my experience as a small business owner, you kind of want to do the basics and then build as the need comes up, right? Because if not, you would spend forever just trying to make the perfect thing for all scenarios. So essentially what that means is you want to list out and articulate what those job tasks are, what are the accountabilities, what are they responsible for, and how are you going to measure that, right? And so when you're going through that, you're thinking through all of these things, right? So then on top of that, and let's say you've now got job description, you know what people are going to do, but now you need a set of kind of guidelines for them to follow. And so in a very small business, essentially, when you first start out, you can just tell somebody else, you can tell one other person what those guidelines are. But as you start to grow, you do need to have more and more policies so that they're written down so that you don't have to re-articulate the same thing over and over again. And then that way they're there for people to interpret on their own, for them to follow different steps. And these are some of the policies that you'll want to think through. What do you need as you go along? So from a kind of a compliance perspective, right, because that's the base of your HR pyramid, there are probably 4 or 5 policies that once you reach 5 employees are mandatory in your organization, right? So these are under occupational health and safety rules. You must have a written violence and harassment prevention policy. You have to have a written health and safety policy. You must have a written AODA policy. So that's Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And you must have an emergency response plan, right? So these are just some of the things that once you reach that magical number of 5 employees, you now have all of these extra responsibilities as an employer. The thing though is that nobody ever tells you this stuff, right? You're just expected to know all of the legislation you need to follow. And that's why being part of organizations like the SLBDC is really important, right? Because I get those emails all the time of important legislation changes that come out, just being part of that network. So there's ways to kind of keep up on what your accountabilities are as employers. So those are some of those things. You've got other best practice policies, right? So things like your hours of work, right? How does that work? You've got things like vacation guidelines and all these other policies that kind of dictate people's behaviors and expectations. Yeah. And then you can add all sorts of policies. I've worked with organizations that have 100 policies. And so it's just important to manage them. I think what's important just to take away from policies in general, from an employment perspective, is they absolutely must be realistic and useful. Right? So if you have policies that nobody follows, okay, they're garbage. They're actually not worth the paper, right, that they're printed on. If you have policies that nobody understands, they're also not useful to you, right? So the whole point of policies is some of them are mandated, but the whole point of them is to minimize risk to your organization. And if people don't know what they are or where to find them or how to follow them, they're not doing anything and you've wasted your time and maybe your money by getting them. Okay, so that's the important piece about that. And so on your slides here, some of these are some of the mandatory things, some of the things you need to be aware of, which we'll talk about kind of when we talk about those government regulations. Any questions on job descriptions, policies? No, it seems that's okay. It's always a challenge where I'm trying not to scare everybody, but I'm also giving you enough information to know, that you might have to ask questions somewhere else. So again, I don't expect you to memorize all of this. It's about knowing kind of what's out there and that there may be areas that you maybe need to check on. So I'm trying not to scare you, to tone it down a bit. I remember doing this with a lawyer was in the group, and the lawyer popped in and he was like, you know, it's scary when the lawyer is scared of this presentation. So I was like, oh, tone it down a bit, Lisa, tone it down. Okay. All right, so the next part. So let's say, so you've got your
Lisa,
policy.
we have a question from Kelly. Is there
Yes.
any difference between brick and mortar and virtual businesses?
There is, and it's interesting, most of it's in the health and safety space. So when, for example, you get big enough that you have 5 employees, do you need a joint, not a joint health and safety committee, but a health and safety representative? And the way that they describe it is if you regularly have more than 5 employees in the workplace. Okay, so in the workplace can be interpreted in a lot of ways, but generally what has come to be interpreted, and this is often by the courts, have come to say that, well, in the workplace, if you work virtually, your workplace is your home. So you could have 15 virtual employees that never see each other, and you would not necessarily need to have a health and safety representative or a written posted health and safety policy necessarily. Best practice that you do, but there's some of those rules where you don't necessarily need some of them. So it honestly depends how you set your business up. So for myself, my team is primarily virtual. We rarely come into the office all at the same time, right? Where there's usually 1, 2, maybe 3 people here, kind of here and there. But we've opted to have our health and safety policy kind of implemented, just it's best practice, and it does kind of get you in that mindset. So it depends. It may also have an impact on things like your insurance and all that other stuff as well. But from a policy perspective, it's still about people, and most of the mandatory ones are health and safety related. Violence and harassment can still happen virtually. Unfortunately, it can also happen with clients. So even if you're a virtual team and you work with clients even virtually, that harassment could potentially happen as well. So it's important to be aware of it. So I hope that helps answer that question. If not, happy to follow up more.
It does. Thanks, Lisa.
No problem. Okay. Anything else on policies? Okay, good. I think we'll move into hiring next. So you've decided you're hiring a person or people. The next piece about that is how do you actually do that? Where are we here? Hang on. Slide 11. I think I jumped ahead too far. Let me back up. Preparing for job policies. Here we are. I knew I skipped one. So when you're hiring, it's not necessarily the same as, you know, perhaps it used to be when you just hire, you put out a job posting on a job board and voila, your answer is there and you've got people. It is now kind of difficult to necessarily find someone. And so it's important that you have kind of a creative reach for where to find talent pools, right? So whether you're looking for skilled labor or retail, or you're looking for more skilled trades, or you're looking for professionals, it depends what you're looking for and who you're going to, but there's a lot of different places and different things to consider when you're trying to find that pool of talent. It's to the point now that employers actually have to go to the talent in order to put the ad in front of them, because there are just so many choices and so many options. So I love this. Always ask other businesses, right? Where do you find your people? How does that work? What do you recommend? Employee referrals are great. So not sure how recent the studies are, but I know about 5 years ago anyway, at least, about 70% of jobs were found through networks, right? Through people that you knew, people who either worked there or people who knew someone who worked there. And so that's still pretty high. It's definitely still over 50%. But that often is the majority of where jobs come from. It's about where are people, and somebody says something, I'm either looking for a job or I'm looking to hire a job. And so that comes in, it's a really important part. And so there's a bit of a balance between hiring a friend of a friend and putting a job posting and being clear about your job description out there, and still having a bit of an objective way to measure, is this person right for the job? Do they have the right skills that I need? And so you do have to make sure you balance that. But sometimes, you know, somebody knows someone and you're just like, oh, you're perfect for the job and I need someone now. And I can tell you, I mean, I've been there. And so there's a balance on how you do that. Yeah, question.
We have a question from Ben. Is there a big difference when using contractors rather than part-time or full-time employees? What are some of the best practices there?
There are major differences, and mostly it's to the risk to the employer. So when you use a contractor, you are hiring another company. So similar to the conversation earlier about you are hiring the accountant or the lawyer or whatever, you're hiring a contractor, so a separate company to do work for you. Oftentimes that other person kind of can start their own business, right, and make it small, and that's fine. If you're hiring an employee, that person is not their own business, and you are now responsible for them and all of the kind of the CRA tax stuff and all the remittances and everything that goes along with that. What happened a few years ago in legislation is that a lot of companies thought they were super smart and they would just hire contractors and give them contracts year after year after year after year and never have to hire them as employees. So they never have to pay the CPP and the EI and the insurance and all that stuff. And so what happened is the courts came out and they said, wrong, that's not fair. You're treating people unfairly. And so even if you make an employment contract with someone that says that they are a contractor, if you treat them like an employee, meaning you tell them where they have to be, you tell them what kind of work they're doing, you give them the material or the tools they need, then that person is actually an employee, regardless of the contract you've written. And what will happen is the CRA, if they find out, which they sometimes do when the relationship goes sour, there's conflict, or there's an audit, whatever it is, you're now on the hook for all of that back pay. And the CRA does not look favorably upon non-payment of that. So there's all of these pieces that come into it.
I actually talked about this, Lisa, in my class today. We were talking about the employee versus the contractor. And the Supreme Court of Canada will use certain tools, like one is how much control is exercised by the employer. The more control by the employer, they're more than likely an employee and not a contractor. If it's integral for the business, or if it's adjunct, more than likely they're a contractor. If it's integral, they're an employee. Ownership of the tools. If it's the employer's tools giving it to the person working, more than likely their employee. Contractor has to do that. The chance of profit. The more chance of profit for the employer, it's probably employee, not in a contractor relationship. So they will look at that. And there's certain dynamics that are really important to consider too. Like they cannot sue for wrongful dismissal if you're a contractor. If an employee commits a tort or a contract violation, vicariously the employer is liable versus the contractor, for example. So there is certain dynamics that the Supreme Court of Canada will look at to distinguish whether it is. And I mean, even then it's been argued before. Lisa, there's another question here from Donna. What about in a situation where two different contractors often give work to each other? What is the best way to work that out?
So it sounds like you might be asking about subcontracting, and I think it depends on your industry or organization. So if you're hiring a contractor and they're truly a contractor, right? And you think about it like your house. If you're hiring a subcontractor to renovate your house or to build your house, you don't necessarily care who they hire to do the electrical and who they hire to do the plumbing and who they do, to do the drywall. And it's their decision on how that works. If you do care, if there's things like privacy or if insurance is a big important piece, you may limit that, but that would be set up in the contract that you set out with them at the beginning. And so some organizations like providing care, for example, to patients have very specific requirements around who does the work and who's qualified and all of these other pieces that come into it. I want to go back to Martin had a comment in there about his accountant warned him about this. I was actually on a panel just as a participant earlier today with accountant, lawyer, and a business professional, and they were talking, and the accountant actually said, the CRA, to them, it's fact. They know who's a contractor and who's not a contractor, and they will tell you if you're doing it right. And then kind of there's these other pieces around having to manage it. Yeah, so absolutely. And so when you work with a contractor too, you can make all sorts of different contractors. You can have short-term contractors who are on a project. You can have them on, as a 3-month at a time. You can have them on, shorter times. Generally though, if you have a contractor and somebody is there and they're working for you full-time, you can't go, it's risky to have one contractor work for more than 12 months without making them an employee. And 2 years, I think, is the absolute max. So if you have a contractor working for you, once you've hit that 2-year mark, it doesn't matter what you've written out, that person is now an employee and you will be financially responsible for them as an employee. Oh, where can I learn about these things? There's a whole bunch of research. You might have more, Jennifer, because I know like you said, there's very specifically 5 rules that the Supreme Court has that says, answer these questions. I know the accountants, the CPAs, they are very much like, here are the rules. But even in today's presentation, it was mentioned that there's so many nuances to it as well that you do have to check with them and confirm. So this is where your advisors come back in.
I'm going to actually, Ben, I will mention this to Chelsea when she's coming on board because she is a lawyer to discuss these things for session 7. But yeah, even in our gig economy right now with the different contracts, if one employer is securing most of your time, then you should be considered an employee if it's compromising everything outside of the additional. But the gig economy, I mean, this is a new thing. They're still trying to figure out the dynamics between what should be allowed and what should not be. Uber, Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, just had a big lawsuit in England recently regarding this issue about whether they should be considered an employer or contractor, because there's certain perks to being an employee that should be considered for the contractor. And like you acknowledged, Lisa, if this comes out and the court decides whether they're distinguished as an employer or employee or a contractor, they have to foot the bill for all of that remittance and all the other aspects that they haven't paid for to date.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In one of the organizations I was working for locally, we went through a right sizing activity and there were contractors who had been hired on. They were contractors for years and years and years and years. They were hired on as employees for 5 years or so. And when they calculated their payout package, it was on the 5 years. And even locally, we had a lot of we had a lot of kind of legal response and you know, and the response was, well, no, I wasn't an employee for 5 years. I was an employee for 25 years. Right. And current HR was like, what? We have no idea. Right. So it can sneak up on you. So it's important to think through these things in advance because they can definitely sneak up and have future repercussions. Contract law, and I'm sure Chelsea will talk about this, is, especially from an employment contract perspective, is really, really important and intense. And there's so much to it. That'll be a good one if you're thinking about it.
We'll have that's the very last session. That's why we left it at the end to discuss any of the contract, like leases and employment contracts and the rest of it.
Absolutely.
Intellectual property, we will be discussing that too, and contracts all revolve around those as well.
Yep. All right, so when we go back to the hiring piece, we're talking about referrals, we're talking about agencies. I love this. I love how I'm in here. But these other groups will do recruitment for you. Well, Workplace Group and Goodwill will do recruitment for you for free. The Lambton College Career Services, so not the actual like co-op department, but the Lambton, the CES, whatever it is, Career and Employment Services, they're out in Petrolia. They're different, will also do a lot of that recruitment. I've had great success with Lambton College Co-op. Bringing in a co-op student is a really creative way to look at getting work done. So first of all, it's short terms. You're not committing to a full, you know, to somebody's career forever. You kind of get to try them out for whether it's a few weeks or a few months, whatever their program is. And what I also love about co-op students is you get like the newest education, right? So they know the top things, the newest things, the technology, all of that stuff. So I love bringing in co-ops. To just kind of essentially, I learn something every time I bring one in to really understand what that is. And the department is great about it. And there's all sorts of grants. And I think I saw that somewhere as well when I'm bringing in co-op students. The other place to go to is if your professional body is going to the colleges that specifically specify in whatever that is that they're training. So for example, PSWs, there's a huge group of them, I think out of Nipissing maybe or Sudbury. And so doing recruitment specifically at those two schools yields a better kind of outcome of talent. If you have, so for me, for example, I'm part of the HR Association. When I post jobs, I post it through our internal hire authority program, specifically targeting HR professionals, right? So there's a lot of different things and places you can look to try to get creative about where do you find your talent. Don't just limit yourself to, you know, posting a job on a physical bulletin board in your community center, for example. So there's lots of different ways to go. All right, so once you've hired, you've posted your job, you've got some candidates, the screening process is really, 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 really important. Spend the time here. I know it's kind of exciting to say, yes, I just want to hire this person. They look great. Let's bring them on. But do your work up front in this screening process, and it will save you tons of time and effort in the long run once you know, if you realize that who you've hired isn't necessarily the right fit. for your job and for your role and for your organization. So I cannot stress enough doing this screening process. Bringing somebody else in to do that is also a good idea, right? And especially if it's our own business, we kind of have that one perspective of, it's my business and I'm passionate about all this stuff, but we don't necessarily objectively see some of those other pieces that could influence it. So things like just our potential biases or the skills needed, right? Or if somebody actually matches those skills, there's all sorts of things that come in here. And I would highly recommend that you don't ever really necessarily hire anybody by yourself, even if it's one of your advisors or a mentor that you just kind of bounce your thought process off of. Sometimes they're able to reflect some things that we're missing when we go through that screening process. The other part about doing this well, so not only is it good for business, you also are trying to minimize your risk of human rights complaint. And so ultimately, when you talk about disabilities and any of the other protected grounds under human rights, if you are not, I actually want to go back to that. So when you're talking about the protected grounds under human rights from an employment perspective, the employer, it's kind of backwards from criminal law, right? So criminal law is you're innocent until proven guilty. In human rights, the employer is essentially guilty until proven innocent. And so not the only, but a good way to make sure that you are proven innocent is to have consistent processes and policies in place that you can say, listen, I follow this process. It's not discriminatory because I do it the same way every time for all these people. These are the advisors I check with. These are the mentors I check with. This is how I check my biases. This is how it's based on this. And so that ultimately is your best protection against discrimination claims. So what happens is if you interview 3 people, one of those people comes back and says, they didn't hire me because I have a disability. You have to prove that you didn't not do that, right? So it's awful, and it's there. The laws are there because there are people who took advantage at some point and kind of screwed over the rest of us who are good business owners. And unfortunately, we have to be very particular about how we follow these. Okay? So this is where I'm saying spend the time in your screening process and make sure that you're following your consistent process, you're checking with people, and you're trying to mitigate that bias and that discrimination potential. Okay, anything else on hiring? So I think we'll get into, so we'll jump into next into kind of that orientation piece. But the screening part, reference checks are so important. If you don't do your reference checks, that's kind of on you to do that. You want to make sure always that you get written consent from your applicants to do reference checks. You don't necessarily want to go kind of stalking them on Facebook or LinkedIn to see where they've been and what they're doing. You want to make sure that they have consent, that you can contact people that they've worked for before. Question, Brad?
That's all. I'm going to say that's all really good for finding a person that's qualified for what you want. I'm going to use our farm as an example. AZ truck drivers you need them, very short demand, like not many of them. Mm-hmm. What about if you hire someone that doesn't have a license, you offer to pay for their schooling to get their license, but you require them to work for you for, let's say, 3 years to recoup your cost of it? Is that legal or right? Or, just looking at a different way, trying to get a person.
Yeah, so I'm going to let Chelsea comment on the legal part of it, but it absolutely is a good strategy. It does come into the contract, right? So the contract you set up in the beginning has to be enforceable. If your contract isn't enforceable and you say, great, we'll pay for the schooling, you've got to work for 3 years, and after 6 months they've got the schooling and they leave, if your contract wasn't set up properly in the first place, I think you're probably out of luck. Right. And so there's always, and I've seen it even in big organizations, small organizations, you can absolutely do that. But you have to make sure that it's very clear up front, and that's what you're doing.
Probably like a restrictive covenant clause, something like that, Lisa?
Probably. And I think they're kind of hard to hold up because honestly, like, let's say you pay for a $10,000, $20,000 training, it's going to cost you probably more than that to recoup that money. If something goes bad. So sometimes what some people will do is say, yep, we'll pay for it if you stay for 3 years. And then they pay kind of like monthly, quarterly, right? Depending on progress milestones. So it's not like you're giving somebody the $10,000 up front to go do the course. But you say, yeah, absolutely, we'll pay for you, but you have to do the course within this time frame. and we'll pay $1,000 up front, and then once you've graduated the course, then we'll pay for the rest of it. So at the very least, they've done the training, and then through that, depending, and this is where kind of your onboarding orientation takes place, is hopefully you've built that relationship with that person that they want to stay and work for you, right? And that risk is minimized. But from what I've heard, and I think it depends on the cost of the training. If it's a huge amount of money, absolutely get a lawyer involved in what that contract looks like. If it's a smaller amount, so for example, for my staff, right, we have mandatory training and stuff we have to do. I give everyone, right, a set dollar amount, not a huge amount, $1,000 a year to do their training. And it's just part of kind of one of the perks of working here, right? So you can absolutely be creative about it. And I think that's a great solution. I would just check on all the scenarios that you come up with and see, what is this going to look like in 12 months? What would this look like in 2 years? What would this look like in 3 years? Just to make sure that you've thought through that. Part of the challenge too is, how do you explain then to your truck drivers who got their own school education and their own training and paid for all that stuff themselves, and they came on 2 months after they did all that by themselves, but now you're paying this guy to do it, right? So you have to think through, what does that look like? What is that communication plan? Because people talk. Even if you say, don't tell anyone what you're getting paid, employees talk about what they get paid and who gets what. And so you have to think through, what is that going to look like when we hire the next person who's just paid for their own stuff? So there's a bit of those. That's the benefit of this whole planning process. If you know that you need that, or if if it might be a thing, work that into your plan and play out some of those scenarios and see how that plays out, both kind of financially and then the impact to everyone else that's on your team or could be on your team. So I hope that helps. All right, so when we jump next, so we're in the next phase here where now you have the employee, and so what do you do with them, right? So there's what we call orientation, or this introduction period. This is, again, one of those absolutely critical pieces that you want to spend your time doing. So not only do you want the person to know what they're doing and to be safe and follow the rules and all that good stuff, but you're building your organization, your company's culture, right? So your organizational culture, they are now the face to the public. Right. So before it was you, and I've gone through this process with myself to be like, oh, can I, and I'm not a micromanager, but I think, okay, well, it's, if something goes wrong, if one of my employees does something wrong, that's my name on it. Right. So how do I kind of let that go, but also give them the support they need to do what I would do, hopefully, in a scenario. So this is important. The first week is really critical. And I will say too, with your employment contract, again, Chelsea will go over this, you have to have it to them and signed before they start work. If they start work and they have not given you the signed contract, that contract is no longer valid. Okay, so there's no point in even getting it from them, and now you have no contract and you're in kind of a whole lot of other risk. So that is really important to make sure that happens before they start work. Then you're going to want to make sure that they've done their mandatory safety training, which is part of this regulatory piece. And a lot of that is available free online that you can access. And it's just really important to make sure that they've done it and that you have documentation that they've done it, because the Ministry of Labor can show up at any time and ask you for that proof. And you have to be able to know where it is and to be able to find it and provide it to them. So this is very, very important stuff. And then, I mean, absolutely, if something were to happen to an employee, if you don't have that, you're also in a lot more risk financially, reputation, all that other stuff as well, if you haven't done that training. And so there's some great tips here, right? I always love like a team lunch, or, go out for lunch the first week, tell people kind of where they're working, what the expectation is, things like dress code and behaviors. And is it okay that I show up exactly at 7:59 if you want me here at 8? And if your expectation is actually, no, I want you to be ready to work by 8, so you might want to be here at 10:02 or 1:45. Those are things you want to make sure that are really clear at the beginning, because if you do that right at the beginning when everyone is excited and happy, it makes dealing with conflict later less difficult. The other part here is probation. And I know there's a lot of kind of different thoughts on probationary period. I think a lot of times it's kind of just wording to say, I'm watching you extra close. I'm going to be a little bit more kind of nitpicky about what you do and give you a bit more coaching. Legally, you cannot have people sign away their rights under the Employment Standards Act. So if you do give a probationary period more than 3 months, you still have to pay those mandatory leave termination dollars if that's what you decide to do. But these are important just to let the employee know that expectation. So it's always continuing on that culture. What are you trying to do? What are you trying to build in your company? When we move into training, there's all sorts of things. We went through this recently for myself, and training is like there's training, then there's development. So there's all these different pieces. But anyway, training is essentially the learning the skills that people need to do their job. And I love this on-the-job training, just-in-time training, formal classroom training. I have a helpful kind of ratio, I guess, that was explained to me quite a long time ago, and it's 70-20-10. So 70% of learning time should be on the job. So by doing, right? We all know we've been in jobs where we've been thrown into it and say, here you go. All right, here's your desk, here's your computer. Go, you've got this task. But right, so on the job training is always an important piece. 20% of it should be coaching, mentoring, observing, shadowing, being kind of taught how to do something. And that 10% of all of that learning and training is that formal classroom training. And so that's just a ratio that has been guidelines. It's kind of, I think, matched with adult learning styles, that kind of thing. So just to know that kind of training isn't always, going to sit at the IEC for hours on end or whatever that is, right? It's important to know that training can be done in a lot of different ways. Okay, what have we got? So I've already mentioned kind of the mandatory training, that safety stuff. You've got regulatory training, we've got professional development, task-specific training. One of the important pieces of training is training on hazards. So as an employer, it's your job to make sure that your employees know what the hazards of the workplace are. So whether they are ergonomic hazards, tripping hazards, ladder use, weather, right? So if you're a retail store and you have to make sure that they're shoveling off the step and that things are slippery, that kind of stuff, you have a legal responsibility to explain to people what the hazards are, how to do the job safely and mitigate those hazards, and what to do if something does happen. Right? And you can find all these things. There's a whole bunch of resources. I love the WSPS website for kind of their list of hazards and what to do, but there's tons of resources out there as well for small business. Okay, any questions? I think we're leaving the training part of things. Not seeing any, I think we're good. Okay. So we move into, what are we on now here? Motivation and loyalty. Yes. Okay. I've talked a lot about this. I'm not going to necessarily kill this one. Your organizational culture is important, right? People need to want to work for you. And that means not just for money, but also for the benefits and the flexibility and the perks and the reputation, and just being happy at work, right? So whether it's intrinsic value, or they're just proud to make a thing, a widget, whatever it is, you have to understand what that is and be able to respond to that. And these are really important things. You can pay, right? Even if you pay absolutely the top percentile of salary, it's only valuable to a certain point. And once it reaches kind of the tipping point of people can pay their bills, it no longer adds as much motivation as it used to. So that's only one motivator. It's important to really understand what is that for your business. When we look at next, 14, yes. So when we're looking here, so paying employees, I've talked about external, internal factors. What I like to call it is total rewards, right? So it's kind of the calculation of all of the things people get for working for you. So it is cash, and then also kind of non-cash things like benefits and all these other kind of things that you get that aren't necessarily cash. And then there's all the intrinsic value that you get to this. But like I said, it's important to make sure that you can pay people. Sometimes a line of credit just on the side is good to have just in case someone like me, for example, who does project work, sometimes that doesn't line up. So I think thinking through all of that is really important. And once you make that commitment to pay people, there is a bit of that anxiety around, okay, well, now I'm responsible for paying people their living wages. But it's just as long as you're kind of keeping these top of mind as you go through, it does, right? It does work out for both parties. It's win-win in the end. Okay. Perfect. We've talked a bit about benefits. And so as we go through these, there's actual benefits, there's health, kind of like extended health and dental benefits, which is one thing we're familiar with. There's a health spending account on top of that, right? So when you're talking about kind of that piece of the benefits, I know when I looked into it for myself, I don't wear glasses, but apparently everyone else in my company does. And $400 over 2 years does not get you very far when in the glasses world. And so things like, so my staff told me, well, we really want a health spending account. I was like, oh, okay, well, let me look at that. Let me consider that. So there's kind of also different options. There are benefits brokers who, once you tell them exactly what it is you're looking for, they'll go out and get all sorts of quotes for you, which is really, really convenient. You don't have to do all the work. And like I said, the chamber's got some. But then again, there's these other perks that come along with stuff, right? And we've talked about a lot of these. So we've got spending accounts. I see that in here. Other benefits, job sharing is also a good idea. Not everyone wants to work full time, right? So I think it's important to think through a lot of these is how can you really leverage that and what makes sense to the people who will work in your company. And so again, it's that kind of mutual benefit.
I know a couple moms that were on mat leave and they wanted to get back to work. So they both shared the two duties of one full-time person so they could both have some time off, and it worked brilliantly and everyone was happy at the end of the day.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had somebody come in, she was a project manager, but had been away from work, right, for 7 years. And I said, well, I need a project manager. And she's like, okay, I'll do 10 hours a week or whatever. It was fantastic. And then, after a year, she moved on to a full-time job, and, I've got my projects all set up great, right? So absolutely, there's so many creative ways to find solutions, I think, that benefit all sides. Okay. When we're looking at performance, so things are going great, that's good, but sometimes things don't go so great, right? So the best way to do it is to ultimately set people up so they know what's expected of them, they know what their job is, they know what they're supposed to do when, and that they know what happens if they don't do their job and what those consequences are. But sometimes that's not always possible, or sometimes people don't necessarily perform for other reasons, not just necessarily because they don't want to or don't know. And so it's important to make sure that you've got a way to say, here's what success looks like, this is how you'll measure it, and put those timelines. And if you've heard of SMART goals, right, they need to be specific, measurable, achievable, right? So realistic, they need to be realistic and timely, right? So a good goal is to say, okay, well, what does success look like? So if you hire a new person, you say, okay, and you can even do this together with that person. In 3 months from now, how will you know if you're doing a good job, right? So it's good that you both have that perspective to understand. So when you get 3 months from now, you guys can both look back and be like, yeah, okay, we did a good job, except I would have done this differently, or I would have done that differently. So I think knowing what those are, and that ties back to your job description, your job posting, is really important. When you do have to deal with progressive discipline, it's always important that you do look at it as a progressive discipline, right? So it's, first time checking to see if they understand what the expectations are. The second time, if it happens again and you know that they know what the expectations are, they get a warning, right? And then the next time after that, it's a pretty serious warning, and that, you may be put on leave or terminated from your job if this doesn't change. And then if that happens, then that's when those next steps come into play. So it's always progressive. Document, document, document. Every time you have a conversation with an employee, make sure that you note it somewhere. I use like a private OneNote drive that I have that I just kind of keep my ongoing notes. Previous jobs I've emailed myself. If I have a note, I send an email and I put it in a folder just so that I know that I have it. If you have a notebook, make sure people can't pick it up and read it. And so just making sure that you're documenting everything. If you do get to the point we'll talk about concerns first, before we get to that other point. If you're handling concerns, question.
Do you always recommend a probation period?
Personally, no. I think it depends on your organization. It depends on the job. It depends on what your expectations are. I think anybody starting any new job should be coached properly, right, until the time that they are able to do the job themselves. But sometimes there are probation periods just to let people know, and especially people that maybe necessarily haven't been in the workforce for very long, or who maybe have come from a different industry, right? So sometimes a probationary period is a good way to very clearly outline that they will be kind of more closely monitored and coached in this period. There's not a lot of legal kind of backup that you can get out of telling someone they're on probation, other than the fact that you are monitoring them more closely and you're not harassing them, right? So that's my opinion. I can tell you that's not necessarily, universal amongst HR professionals. So I'm always happy for you guys to get other opinions on that. But that for me is, I think it really depends. I'm not a huge fan of them. I find that the work of writing the wording in the contract and making people follow the rules is not necessarily, doesn't really give the value out of it.
Got another question. Can a contractor role serve as a de facto probationary period?
If you're treating them like an employee, yeah. Yeah. It depends sometimes. So things like for benefits, sometimes that's not always the case, right? Your benefits provider may not kick in benefits directly if you're considering them as being employed for 3 months and then getting benefits right away upon officially being an employee. But if you've treated them like an employee the whole time, it probably is okay. But again, I would double check to see what you've done in other cases or what you plan to do in the future. Because whatever you do, you should be consistent about it. So if this particular person is a contractor and now they're a full-time employee, no probation, but this person was a contractor, but you're giving them probation, that's not seen as kind of fair and transparent management processes. So I wouldn't recommend that. Okay, so if we go back to handling concerns, obviously conflict management, conflict resolution is an important part of being a leader. And this is going to happen. People will have conflict. We're human. That's just part of what we do. And so it's important to make sure that you have resources to understand how to manage that. And often it's important to just hear both sides of the story and to be able to have respectful dialogue around understanding what the problem was and then coming together to say, okay, what are we going to do to fix this? And you can always, even in these cases, I highly recommend reaching out to mentors, to advisors to understand, right? Make sure that you're asking the right questions, understanding different perspectives. One of the other pieces around concerns for me that often comes up is that question around accommodation for any of the protected grounds in our human rights. And so before you go into discipline, always rule out medical concerns or disability concerns first before going to progressive discipline. And that's sometimes a difficult conversation to have because not all disabilities are visible. But it is a legal requirement for you as an employer to make sure that you have checked to see if somebody needs accommodation for a disability first before moving to disciplining them for a behavior. Because if it turns out that that behavior was caused by the disability, you're now also, again, back in trouble. So better just to ask first and support people in accommodation than to get into human rights trouble. All right, so termination is nobody's favorite part of running a business. Unfortunately, it does happen. It's important. Sometimes I call it a trend. I had somebody call it transition. I'm transitioning to my next opportunity, whatever that is. So it's important just to make sure that people are being treated with respect through the whole process. So whether it's a voluntary termination or non-voluntary termination, you want to make sure people are treated with respect. You want to make sure that you're checking in with your accountant, that all of the things that you have to pay are paid, and that any kind of notice period is paid, any of those severance costs are paid, and this will come back to your employment contract. Right? And employment contracts they go back forever, way back until, the first employment contract. So if you hired someone 20 years ago on a contract and you have not recontracted, there may be things in that contract from 20 years ago that you're now still held to. So again, thinking through that whole HR management process is important. And then, yeah, there's all the paperwork that goes with it. So your ROEs have to be issued within 10 days. They've calculated all sorts of things. If you've terminated someone from their role and a vacation day or a stat holiday would have been in their notice period, right? You've got to calculate that vacation pay. So there's all sorts of calculations that go in, and it's always important to check with your accountant, or sometimes your software will actually do it for you if you have a good accounting software that knows what's going on. Okay. Again, it's about treating people with respect. I've heard some people talk about termination as if you're having a breakup, right? So if you're breaking up with somebody, you generally don't throw out all the things they did terribly, and end angrily and go on your way. You want to try to be respectful, kind of, it's me, it's not you, and having that written down and documented, and always have two people in that conversation too. It's not fun. Nobody's doing it. No. All right, so that's all the paperwork, letters, all sorts of stuff. There's all sorts of people. Oh, Ryan had to do this a week ago. It's not fun, Ryan. All right, so then we get into the fun stuff. I know we've been talking for about an hour, so maybe probably not super excited about legislation at 7:45 at night, but it is important things. I've talked about it a lot, so I'm not going to kill this for you, but know that your human rights stuff is important. And when you look at legislation, and this is when I talk about the HR pyramid, we're looking at compliance, if there's any contradiction between the different laws that you have to follow, human rights is at the top. That's the one you would follow if there's contradiction. Then you're looking at kind of your accommodation, your AODA. Then you're looking at your occupational health and safety. And then way down here is your Employment Standards Act. And then in here somewhere is your PIPEDA, your privacy, your pay equity, all that other stuff. So keeping in mind, human rights law is at the top if there is contradiction between the different legislations. And it's important. So you're not expected to know everything about every law. You're expected to know what applies to your business, though. And it can be complicated and it can change, but it's important to have that understanding before you really kind of get into a lot of things. It's worth the time to sort these out. So discrimination, so human rights is important. Pay equity is important. That kicks in once you've reached 10 employees. So again, there's another threshold there. Working conditions, compensation. So these are just really talking, it's kind of a combination of human rights. You're talking about employment standards. You're talking about the CRA rules, right? So you've got tax law, you've got all sorts of stuff in here. And employment standards sets out your minimums required. So people, again, cannot sign away their rights to employment standards. You have to pay them the minimum standards regardless, no matter what, but you can go over and above that. And one thing in employment standards I always want to point out is the legislated leaves. Okay, so there are a bunch, 10, 15 or so legislated leaves under the Employment Standards Act in Ontario. What that means is these are reasons that you cannot fire somebody if they take the leave. Okay, one example is parental leave. Right, so when you take maternity leave, you can't be fired without a big payout and all sorts of stuff. And we kind of all know that. We've known that for a long time. But there's things in there like compassion leave and family responsibility leave. And all these other leaves are in there. You're not expected to know what they are, but you are expected, if an employee comes to you and needs a leave, that you help them sort out which leave is best for them, because what you put on an ROE will impact if they get the benefits from EI or not. So there's all sorts of different EI benefits, things like compassionate care leave, domestic violence leaves, all of these leaves, you as the employer and what you put on that ROE will determine their eligibility. Well, not will determine, but is an important factor in determining their eligibility. Okay. So these are kind of things that you'll have to look up if you find yourself in that situation, but important to be aware of. Okay, government requirements assistance, so employment health and safety, workers' comp, again, these are things that help minimize your risk to your organization. Some industries don't have to opt in or don't have to pay WSIB, but you can opt in to WSIB if you're not there. Sometimes that's a good way to put kind of a competitive advantage over some of your competition, if that's one of where you find yourself. But often WSIB, oftentimes you just have to pay it and they're there to help you. So if there's an employee injury, the employee fills out a Form 6 and it's all online, and the employer fills out a Form 7. If the employee goes to the hospital or to a doctor and mentions that it's a workplace injury, the hospital or doctor or whoever it is will also fill out a form. So there's many, many ways for the WSIB to be notified of a workplace injury or incident. So it's always best practice just to have everything kind of documented anyway. And then to help employees through whatever it is they're going through. And I don't know if our second speaker came on, but insurance is insurance. So their job is to get you back to work. But they also do have a lot of really great resources. I've called the WSIB to get help for myself. They're pretty great, right? So a bit of a tip on there. And then we've got some money for stuff, training programs, all these different pieces. I'm not sure I can speak entirely to them, other than I know, oh yeah, municipal government, all sorts of rules to follow. So these are all the things to consider. And you guys, when you'll go through this presentation after as you're writing your plan, you'll do a check and see, does this apply to me? Does this apply to my organization? What do I need to know? What do I need to do? All right, so when we get into record keeping, I've said it, document everything. You do need to have an employee remittance number if you have employees. So you get that through the CRA, you get your number. You need to keep track of payroll. I hate payroll personally. I find it terribly tedious and awful and complicated, and I outsource that right away. You can do it yourself. Other people have survived doing that. It's just not one of my favorite things, but it is really, really, really important. And you will have employees that are also looking at it detail by detail. So very important to make sure that you're doing it right. Integrated accounting. So this question, is there an integrated accounting payroll software? When I first started my business, I actually loved Wave. Wave? It was a free software. I loved it. It did more in payroll for remittances and all that stuff than QuickBooks does. I opted out of it because it sometimes would have glitches for integrating with your bank account, but you can manually upload your transactions. And it didn't have the analysis that I wanted, right? So my business got big enough that I needed to do project analysis, and Wave doesn't do that. Wave is very basic, it's simple, it's pretty, it's easy to use. I actually really liked it. It's free until you add the payroll stuff. And then I think it was about $25 or so a month or something like that. I moved into QuickBooks personally. I like it. It's not as pretty, it's not as user-friendly. But
We'll be highlighting that stuff, Ben, next week.
Next week, yes. I think there's lots of options. I think if you find an accountant, they'll also have recommendations. So if you find someone you want to work with, use a system they love, right? But if you have to get a system first before your accountant, I would ask other colleagues, and you'll learn more next week.
Gina made a comment, Quicken is also good.
Quicken, nice. I've never used it. FreshBooks. I've heard about FreshBooks. So there's lots of options, All right, the monthly remittance, also a pain in my butt. But these are remittances that you have to make. Do find your accountant. Ask all these questions next week. I'm not the best person to ask about these, but I know they're really, really important.
We're focusing on financials and accounting next week.
Yeah.
That's why we broke this down, so we can focus on a certain discipline.
Perfect. Same with your year-end statements, T4s. Those aren't as bad. I don't mind T4s.